This week we have a returning guest. Professor Greg Keeffe is a professor in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University, but he's currently a visiting critic at Cornell University in America. So, Greg, thanks very much for getting up and joining us.
Yeah, hi Brian, nice and early here.
Yeah, I was going to say the last time we talked to you, you were in the Lake District, and now you're in Cornell. So I'm not sure. Is there some kind of word for pandemic jealousy?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting, really. I was head of school in Queens, and after 5 years you get a sabbatical. So I'm on sabbatical at the moment. So.
That's a reward for staying sane as head of school, is it?
yeah, it is.
You get the escape. And because I was thinking about it, because when I had what's the weather? When I was looking at the weather forecast at Cornell last week, it was kind of snowy. Is it still snowy?
Yeah, it's all melted now, but I think it's going to snow again this week. It's in the transition now between warm and cold. It's usually warm till middle of November and then suddenly goes cold. It's quite an interesting climate, really.
Yeah, because I was just the premise of a kind of visiting scholar coming into winter when snow. It just sounds like some kind of romantic comedy you see on Netflix. So I'm not sure if it's that exciting in real life. Cornell, I mean, just before we get into it, I mean, what's it like? Because I had a look at their website. It does like some kind of liberal utopia. Is it quite nice? Or
yeah, it is like a liberal utopia. It's a bit like British universities in the 1980s, Brian. You know, before we got KPIs and the REF and National Student Survey. Things go at quite a modest pace compared to the UK. So it's quite pleasant.
That is interesting. Do you think that's unique to Cornell? Because I always thought American universities would be quite capitalist and all about the money. Huh?
Yeah, I think Cornell is very geared towards liberal arts and equality and things like that. They say no student will not come to Cornell because they're short of money. So they means test everybody. It's got probably the widest range of sort of different sorts of people in the whole of the sort of the Ivy League. So it is quite an interesting place from that point of view.
And you mean your colleagues back home? I'm sure you probably know. I've been striking last week. And when I was talking to some friends at Queen's, about the various issues. I mean, for me, I don't really understand who benefits from this whole marketisation of universities and the actual stress and the RAF and, all these things that everything's a bit of research now and research funding. And are you kind of seeing it with, I know probably maybe don't want to get into the politics of it, but do you kind of wonder yourself, I mean, what was the sense in going down this route of, where half the population are now going to university and, it's so much money and fees and everything else?
Yeah, I think that people should be able to get educated. I think all education should be free at the point of delivery. I think that's definitely true. I think one of the problems is with this marketisation is that everybody has to be world class. So it doesn't matter whether you're at Lincoln University or you're at Cambridge. The narrative will be exactly the same at both places. It's crazy, and I think that's been one of the problems with it. That there's been no sort of differentiation in the market, really. And which if you were going to make a market, you'd have created really good places to learn trades, really good places to learn to do other manual tasks or learn to, care or something. But instead, the university experience is the same for everybody, which I think is a bit of a shame.
That could be an interesting slogan for a university. Come to us. We're average, we know our limits, So during lockdown, one of the things that I discovered YouTube, right? Which kind of sounds a bit weird, and that I'm an internet expert who's been on the internet for 25 years. I'm only kind of recently discovering YouTube. But once you go down the kind of rabbit hole, you discover all these kind of fantastic little niches. And one of them is a whole area of kind of urban planning and environment and all your kind of stuff. And there's a guy, I think I sent you a link, Not Just Bikes. It's like a Canadian guy who moved to Holland, and he does these little videos of life in Holland and the various transport policies, and it's very entertaining. I mean, that kind of YouTube format, it's quite an entertaining way of conveying different material. So I've been thinking quite a lot, about urban design, and I know we talked about this before, how the kind of pandemic's going to affect things. And you're in the land of the free, and one of the videos I was watching was it made this kind of comment that after World War II, all the American cities have been spared from the violence. So all the returning GIs, what they decided to do was destroy the cities themselves to make car parks. And you had all these fantastic downtown areas that were kind of leveled, and you kind of see these photos from the era of car parking flats for miles around. So when you're in the States, I mean, did you kind of think about these kind of issues of kind of urban design and how we can improve it?
It's been amazing being here, actually, because where Cornell is the town is called Ithaca. It's 50,000 people, but it covers the area of which it has 1 million people in Greater Manchester. So it's amazing, and I don't have a car, so I walk this city, and it's incredible. You never meet anyone else walking. There are huge car parks in the city centre. The town centre has a range of shops, but there's no cafes, no social infrastructure, very little social infrastructure. And the car is king. Many of the things that you get taken to by other members of the faculty are just random places out of town for, say, which is a restaurant, and it's in a field out next to a forest or something. There's no connection between things unless you have a car. It's really, really interesting, and the cars all drive incredibly slowly. It's the other thing. They trundle along at 20 miles an hour. And there's hundreds of crossroads. There's no roundabouts. So every junction is a 4-way crossroad, and you have to stop and see if there's cars coming, and then the cars negotiate, and then they cross. And so it takes people hours to get around this thing. It's quite different from Europe. And I don't know how retrofittable it is for other forms of transport. The density is so low. I can't imagine anything but personal transport ever working. So
it's like the scene in National Lampoon's European Vacation, where that stereotype Americans are terrified of roundabouts.
yeah, exactly.
He just keeps going round. Or what do you call them? Is it turning circles? Isn't it?
Yeah. There's only one in the whole of Cornell. In the whole of Ithaca, there's one roundabout apparently.
And are people terrified to go near it?
Yeah, they are. People drive miles to avoid it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know you had to say even in the States, younger people aren't buying as many cars, and they're not driving. Remember in the past, like as soon as you were 16, you were getting a car and your license. So I mean, to say even in America, that kind of trend is starting to change.
Yeah, certainly in cities, that's definitely the case. And electric mobility is becoming very popular. I was in New York City a couple of weeks ago, and there's thousands of people on electric scooters, on the road, on the pavement, everywhere, with no lights on, and at night it's quite amazing, but yeah, there's definitely a change happening in cities, definitely. I think the burbs are still quite full of cars,
And when did you see the electric scooter thing? Was it a positive, or were you kind of fearful for your life?
Well, both. I think it's fantastic because obviously it's a really cheap way to get around, and it's very sustainable. But at the moment, the roads aren't made for it, so there's people on the pavements riding along at quite speed because the American scooters go faster than the UK and Ireland are governed by EU, and we're limited to 20 kilometers an hour. They do 20 miles an hour. So which is quite a lot faster, and you really notice that when you're out and about. But I do think electric mobility is the future. I think it's going to really change cities.
Yeah, I mean, it can be transformational, especially this kind of electric bikes, because it is one of the main, like in Holland now, electric bikes outsell normal bikes. And they said for one of the main benefits is older people, and it kind of keeps them cycling for longer because they can get a bit of assistance. So you can see from that perspective, it could be quite transformational on people who maybe aren't fit enough to do 5-10 miles on a normal bike. Electric mobility opens that up.
Yeah, well, you can see that there was an article the other day in the cycling press that the e-bike industry will be worth something like 300 billion by the end of the decade. Like incredible amounts, because the whole world's getting into it. And you see a lot of it in Ithaca. Lots of people take their children around on electric cargo bikes, with the kids sat on the back.
Oh yeah, the Dutch style. Yeah,
Dutch style things, and there are quite a lot of them around here now. So things are changing. Bikes are low maintenance and quite cheap compared to cars, and they do the same thing, really, get you around. And there's a car share here that's quite good. I've used the car share a few times, where I pay $8 an hour to hire a car. For example, I had to come back to England and I needed a COVID test, and you can only get a drive-through COVID test. so I had to hire a car in order to get a COVID test. And it was like quite a bizarre experience, because the COVID test was $300.
Wow!
Right, which I could claim on the insurance that the health insurance Cornell had given me. So it's $300. I had to get to this out of town sort of giant pharmacy that was about the size of, I don't know, it's probably the size of City Hall in Belfast. It's enormous.
Big megastore.
It's a pharmacy. And then the sign, I said, COVID testing this way. So I went around the corner, and then it said, tune your radio to 107 FM for instructions. And this sort of American woman came on and said, do not open your windows. Stay in the queue. Someone will come to you with a test. So we had to do the test in the car and then give them the test back in this sort of, and the person was dressed in like an NBC nuclear suit, even though they were taking this little test off her. So it was quite amazing, But America's really good at making things extreme. It's one of the things it's really good at.
When we were in the States, we used to go to the drugstores, and you could buy like 500 pill bottles of like paracetamol and ibuprofen, and I think it took us about 10 years actually to use this ginormous bottle. In Europe everything's limited to 16 to stop you overdosing.
Yeah, exactly.
And in where you are in Cornell, I mean, is there? I thought that's kind of curious. You say even in kind of like a kind of very liberal town, it's still quite car dependent. So you think even like when you go around America, even more rural areas and across, I mean, the car very much is still king, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. Well. Even and they're bigger than cars. They're these utes, these SUVs with a pickup, and they're absolutely enormous. And
Ford 150s and stuff.
Yeah, and they have. The first car I hired here was a Dodge Grand Caravan. And it was enormous. It had eight seats in it, and it was like wider than a normal car, and it had like a 5-liter engine, and it was an automatic. And I just felt it was just like eating the planet as it went along,
Yeah, it's crazy because I mean, you probably noticed, but the American interstate system was developed during the Cold War with the ability to carry tanks. So that's just kind of why the roads are so wide and they're so numerous. It's kind of part of the defense mechanism.
Yeah. There's some. Yeah, Hilbersheimer did some. Who was a sort of German architect urbanist, did some really interesting Cold War city designs, which were all about distributing people around the country so that one bomb couldn't get everyone. Because we were very worried about one bomb hitting New York, paralyzing the country, so they were wondering whether they could spread New York around the state far enough apart so airburst blasts wouldn't get everybody, So there was lots of really interesting Cold War studies.
Yeah, I mix COVID like a bit. It's not quite as extreme. So, I mean, since we last talked, I mean, I kind of wonder, has some of the initial utopia ideas starting to kind of fall by the wayside? Because I know the last time we talked to me, Belfast was experimenting with more cycle lanes, and I know you probably haven't been back in a while, but a lot of that kind of stuff is fallen by the wayside, and it seems we're as bad as ever for traffic jams and people using their cars and that. I mean, is that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think generally there's been a slight retrenchment, but not always. Certainly, I think obviously the little parklets on the Ormore Road and things are still there, aren't they? Some of the staff in Queens, Rachel Grady designed those, and they've been really quite successful. But I think having talked to Belfast City Council, they're really keen on change. That they're just trying to work out how to affect it in policy. Policy is always slower than reality. It takes time to do things. I think like the Million Trees project is a good example of that. That rapid deployment isn't easy because there's issues to do with whether the tree roots hit services and whether people want them outside there, and they're waiting for all the complaints about leaves landing on people's cars, and all these different things. And so it ends up being quite difficult it sounds so easy, but it's actually quite difficult to do in a rapid way. You have to take time, and we haven't really got much time. I think that's one of the problems about the position we find ourselves in. When the climate emergency is a sort of a slightly slow emergency. COVID was a fast emergency, but the climate emergency is sort of a slow emergency. It's a funny pace. When someone says you've got 8 years till the really serious tipping points, that's a funny measure of time, isn't it? We 2 weeks we understand an emergency in a couple of weeks, but 8 years, it just seems just a little bit too far ahead for us to do anything.
It's kind of, well, you will know this when you're students, if you give them like 3 weeks for an essay, they'll leave it the night before. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we all do that. We're all creatures of deadlines. Yeah.
The green stuff is fascinating because I am like of a hippie disposition. I cycle and walk and vegetarian. I voluntarily buy tofu the whole 9 yards. But I think it is a very hard, this kind of climate emergency stuff. It's hard to deal with. It's hard to process. And even I find myself switching off because it's just like, we're all going to die. Like, what the hell do you do? And it's hard to kind of make this stuff less, do you know what I mean? There's end times, there has to be some way of softening it.
I can see that. I had a student a couple of years ago who got severe eco-anxiety from being part of my studio to the point where he couldn't get up in the morning, and he was so depressed. But actually, I think he found that agency sort of cured it. So he started doing things, and that made him feel better, and I think there is something about looking at personal issues rather than global issues, is one way you can deal with it. Even though I'm not massively into folk politics, I know we need bigger things than that, but I think it does help people,
Well, it's that idea. What's that cliche? But you put on your oxygen mask first before helping others.
Exactly. Yeah.
You can only sort yourself out.
Yeah.
And from the last time we've talked, we've had this kind of the Great Resignation, which is another fascinating kind of social phenomenon, because for the last few years, everyone's been telling us how AI and automation was going to destroy all our jobs.
Yeah.
And the opposite's true, in that there's a skill shortage in practically every industry going, and a people shortage. And I know even in the States, I think they said they're like 100,000 teachers short. Yeah. And it's everywhere you go, there's just a staff shortage. So, have you any kind of views on that kind of the Great Resignation, or the take your job and shove it, as they're calling it?
Well, it's interesting that it's coincided with the maximum wealth differential in history. Basically, I have experience of architecture offices, and every recession, salaries went down, but the partners' salaries went up. And it's gone to the point where a friend of mine who ran an urban design practice in the 1970s, as a partner, he used to get a 10% uplift on a typical architect that employed salaries. So the salaries were incredibly flat, and he was only making 10% extra. And now partners in firms are making 10 times more than people in practice. So I think, and a lot of my students say, join a smaller architecture firm that hasn't got too many partners, because you'll get paid more, because the partners get paid so much. And I think we need a rebalancing of sort of the economics of work at some point.
Yeah, I mean that's it. Because it says at the moment people have the power really to kind of to kick back against poor salary and unfair conditions and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and also I think in Europe food is cheap. Actually you can live quite cheaply in Europe compared to America. Food is very expensive in America. Certainly if I'm vegetarian too, and so I don't buy. I don't go to McDonald's where you can buy a burger for 99 cents, but things like peppers or sweet potatoes or broccoli are at least twice as expensive as Europe.
Oh, I know all about it because we used to go to Whole Foods or Whole Paycheck, as Americans call it. And I remember one time there was a single apple was $3.
Yeah.
And a liter of freshly squeezed orange juice is $21.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously our agricultural system has been funded by Europe, and by leveling up of different farms systems around Europe, from small Italian farmers, and French farmers, they were subsidized, so the price of food was relatively cheap.
Mm-hmm. When I heard you were in New York State, I kind of took my mind back to, do you know the story of like intentional communities? I forget how is it Oneiden?
Yeah,
in the 19th century.
Yeah,
I was kind of curious. Have we seen any of that materializing? Because I think it's an interesting phenomenon if people can work from anywhere in the world and people still like community and to be social. I mean, you would think that is there kind of, because I hear like anecdotal stories of people like kind of house sharing in Portugal or in Thailand, and you'd be kind of interested to see is that kind of, because you will know from studying history and being an academic that everything kind of repeats itself. Another kind of Victorian age. And I'm kind of wondering, will we see like intentional communities kind of coming back as people are more flexible but still need community?
Yeah, well, I think you certainly in the States, a lot of wealthy people left New York City during the pandemic and moved up the Hudson, to Albany or to ski resorts, sort of places where they and Northern want to. I've been told Northern want to move back. Lawyers are demanding that they work at home 4 days a week and they don't come in. And that they are now, transforming those neighborhoods into these sort of workplace cafe society thing where they go to work in a cafe. So I think things are happening like that. I think there's a mobility amongst people. I found it even, I'm still working at Queen's even though I'm in America because, unlike I'm talking to you, because we've got virtual ways of getting around now. I've been to about 6 conferences since the summer, but I haven't actually traveled anywhere to go to any of them. They've all been online. There's a real big change in the sort of, I think that's the bit of IT that we never saw coming that has really changed things, which is a Zoom, Teams sort of world, which is really connecting us in a different way with people.
But how are you finding it? Because I know kind of friends. I mean, I'm not too bad. I don't do too much Zoom, so I know other friends are kind of ready to crack up if I have to do another Zoom or Teams call.
Yeah.
It can be hard work sometimes.
Yeah. I think teaching on Zoom is really hard work. The more people are on at once, the harder it is. When it's one-to-one, most of my stuff is with my researchers or with members of staff. So it's mainly one-to-one. But yeah, I agree. When it gets to, I did a lecture in Holland to 250 people and trying to work out whether any of them were getting it or understanding it or feeling it, was really difficult to tell. You don't see that sort of, you see loads of initials on the screen. You don't see the glazed look in their face,
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think it's changing lots of practice, whether it's, if I was talking to a lawyer who works, across the country here, and they were traveling once a week to LA. They're a music lawyer, and they traveled once a week to LA, and they haven't been there for a year, and yet the contracts have still been dealt with, and so that could be a really big change. That actually we might reduce the amount of mobility. There's certainly a lot less flights from Manchester to Belfast and there's only one a day at the moment, and they used to be full. There used to be like 4 a day, and there wasn't a spare seat, on any of the planes. So there's a change.
I have a friend who's a lawyer in Silicon Valley, and she was saying before this, her average travel expenses was $100,000 a year. Because one of the things, if you're like a solicitor in America, they work you like a dog, but you get to stay in kind of nice hotels and you get business class and all this here. And she said with the pandemic, switching to Zoom, the law firm was saving an absolute fortune, in traveling expenses. And then also she said like it's just unnecessary, because a lot of time you were heading halfway across the country just for like a 1 hour meeting or to sign something. It could have just been done online.
Yeah, well, and obviously that money is all oil, And so actually that's a big reduction in carbon,
Mm-hmm. So if we had been talking 5 years ago, everyone was saying the future of the world is cities. People are navigating towards cities, and that's where young people want to be, and the cultural and the action and all that. Do you think is that still the case? Because what we're seeing now is with this fragmentation, people are moving kind of maybe to more rural areas or second tier cities. I know people from Silicon Valley are moving like the Austin area or Colorado and what have you, or even in Belfast. People have been moving, if they don't need to go in the city or commute, they've just been moving to Macrofelt or Tyrone or wherever they may be from originally. So do you think that kind of the growth of the cities may kind of stall, or you still think maybe a mix of both, or how do you see that going?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and I think it's probably the $1 million question. I think the problem is cities have become overpriced for the wage ecology that sits in them. When I bought my house in Manchester, I bought it in 1988. It cost £30,000, and I was on £12,000 a year as a research fellow. And Mel, my partner, was doing a PhD and was on £4,000 from the ESRC as a grant. And we could buy a nice terraced house in an up and coming neighbourhood and do it. Whereas that house, I sold it in the summer for £600,000.
Whoa!
And therefore you'd need a £200,000 income to buy that house, and the street hasn't materially changed really in that time.
That's insane.
And I think that's one of the problems with cities is that I was talking to people in New York City, and they were saying you need a trust fund to live in New York if you're a young person, and that can't be good for a city. There's no surprise that Berlin's been really successful over the past 20 years culturally, because it's still a relatively cheap city to live in if you're a young person.
Did you watch the Minktopia series about the property market in Manchester?
Yeah, I did. Yes, yeah.
It because I found it. I was fascinating, especially this kind of this idea of like Russians and Chinese people just buying security boxes in the sky. These kind of apartments off plan, and they'll never set foot in them. It's a kind of a weird world, isn't it?
Yeah, well, one of my students did a fantastic thesis project when I worked at Manchester, where they had an apartment that overlooked the Beetham Tower, which was the largest residential tower in Europe. And every evening at 9:00, she took a photo of how many lights were on in the building, and then she superimposed those photos on top of each other. So she had 300 photos for near enough the whole year, and around about 50% of the flats had never had a light on in them.
Wow, it's terrifying.
So they were all speculative properties, probably funded either Chinese or Russian or somewhere. So you realise that these aren't apartments; they're actually safe deposit boxes.
Yeah,
technically, aren't they? They're like giant safe deposit boxes where you put your wealth in a box somewhere where no one can get to it or something. And it's an interesting problem for architecture, because we like to think it's about people, but it's also about laundering excess capital.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, from a Marxist viewpoint.
On the subject, because we had the same problems in Ireland at the moment. North and south, there's a big housing shortage, probably more so in the Republic, where it's like really, really bad. But they're building some houses near me, and they're just building like one detached house and like two semis Okay, so 3 houses. And it's taken them about a year to do it. So every day I pass it when I'm walking my son up to school. And it's fascinating to watch, the different, see it developing. But I'm thinking to myself, are we not looking at now in the modern world of using some kind of more prefab processes to create houses in bulk? Because it still seems very, very slow and inefficient process. I mean, are we any better at these kind of mass?
Yeah, there are quite a few systems for building sort of volumetric ones and also component based sort of modular systems. The main problem with them, particularly with housing, is that especially on small sites, if you look at your profit on the site, it's probably from the last 2 houses on the site. So if you've got say if you've got 10 houses on there, the profit is all in those 10 houses. And the problem is that the systems aren't flexible enough to get enough properties on the site. Generally, you have to do a skinny one here and one that bends around the corner there to fill the site up. And so it's the architecture that makes the money, and not the building system. And the problem with that is that those volumetric systems don't allow for enough flexibility to fill sites efficiently. And that's why they're not so popular. You get a lot more of that sort of stuff in office buildings or in retail sheds and things. But in houses, it needs careful curation of sites in order to maximize the potential on them.
Okay, that is interesting. Because you kind of think, like, even in that situation where I suppose something had to be custom designed, that you could still kind of send the plans to the prefab factory or whatever he would, custom cut. Because no idea, I saying, what did I call it? What do I call it? 3D printing and all these here types of things, that they've got. It just does seem to be, because when you have a shortage of skilled workers. Yeah. And bricklayers and plumbers and all that. I mean, to me, the only thing possible is to have some kind of prefab structure, kind of like they did post-war.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because people like Hanson do some quite interesting ones, and Belfasts have done some houses. The problem is that you're limited to about 2.9 meters on a road, so that limit, which isn't really wide enough for a room. You can go to 3.5 if you get a police escort, and then not every road can take those things,
oh yes,
so there are quite a few issues with them. 3D printing's quite interesting, but obviously we need insulation in the properties as well as concrete, so that it still means it's an on-site task. I think. I think it is coming, but it does have quite a few difficulties. The component-based systems, which are easier, like for example in Holland they have these giant breeze blocks that are sort of a meter by a meter, and they assemble the wall really quickly with 20 breeze blocks rather than 50, so they can build things quite quickly. But then the second fit of electricity and hot water in there still takes time. Those things are quite complex, and pipes have a tendency to break in transit, and and there's a lot of different issues to do with these things.
Yeah, nothing's ever simple. No. Recently as well, they're discussing like how we kind of retrofit housing to move away from fossil fuels, which seems to me is going to be incredibly difficult, because I looked into it myself because was curious to try it, and for our 3-bed semi in Belfast, and I only spend about maybe £400 or £500 a year on oil, not much. It was going to cost about 10 to 15,000 to put in a heat exchanger. Yeah, right. And then when you talk to people that've got heat exchangers in, they kind of complain that they don't warm up to the same extent as an oil or gas does. And then also your electric bill goes through the roof, like I won't believe. Mm-hmm. So you kind of think the task of actually switching away from fossil fuels for home heating and a lot of these things it's a monumental one. Mm.
It certainly is. Yeah, no, I'm just putting a heat pump in my house at the moment. I already have solar hot water in my house, so I did solar hot water first. That's been really quite successful. I've got an evacuated tube collector on the roof, and it produces hot water. Probably it does all my hot water demand between February and November, so it's only 2 months when I need to use any fossil fuels for that. And I'm just changing to a heat pump now. But yeah, there are issues. But I'm photovoltaiking the whole of my roof to produce the electricity for the heat pump. So that's one thing. And then I'm putting in, because I've got a bit of room, I'm putting in a really large hot water store. So I can hopefully sort of charge up when my cells are doing well and not use too much of the grid. But yeah, there are difficulties. The problem with heat pumps is that they're not great at producing. They're great at transferring heat, but not great at producing a high quality of heat. The temperature is generally quite low. Usually about 45 degrees C in the pipes, whereas your boiler produces 75 degrees centigrade in the pipes. So obviously it doesn't have the intensity that a fossil fuel thing has, but it's going to be a monumental thing. But I would say save energy first, so you're better spending the money on triple glazing, insulation, draft stripping and things like that before you get onto the system, and most houses are very poor on that.
Give everyone fleeces,
Yeah.
And see. On the subject of cities, I mean, I have been in Belfast city centre, I think, once now in nearly 2 years. I took a trip down, and I mean, I don't know if you're still in been in contact much with the council, or I know you're in different groups, but I mean, are people nervous? Because I know I talked to a lot of people who are absolutely would be happy if they never have to set foot in Belfast city centre again for work or for anything else. And I think I kind of wonder, the council's starting to get a bit nervous. Will people ever really want to go back to offices and the commuting and all the rest of it?
Yeah, there's a high street task force which I'm on. There's a range of people on that trying to work out what to do. It's a really, really interesting problem. I was reading with interest not only how Amazon have destroyed the high street. They're now in where they've built this huge Amazon distribution shed in Swindon. They're now stealing the employees from all the businesses. So eventually they're going to eat everything. And I think it's a problem. But I think the problem is bigger than that. I think we misunderstood what city shopping was really about. It was really about meeting. It was really about meeting and being entertained and being present in a group and having identity, and less about the things. And actually, I don't think we've worked out how to make an environment that doesn't necessarily sell things. That's also that can be, all those things, at once. And I think that's going to take a bit of imagination, I think, about what cities are to become. I think young people are still going to cities. I think when you go around the city, it's generally got a higher proportion of young people than it had previously. I think it's older people who are staying away.
Yeah, from it. Because I know if you might have seen in the news, one of the Belfast groups won the Turner Prize.
Yeah.
I forget what they're called, but they had this kind of installation. But a lot of the artists I was chatting to were saying that a big problem now in Belfast is there's just no studio space for artists to work. Yeah. And that's a problem because, I mean, arts bring a city alive and kind of culture makes it's kind of like the heart of the city. So I mean, I always think like that could be an easy one for the council to do more to kind of support artists and give them space and cheap rents and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised that there aren't any bigger developers because in the rest of the UK, people like Urban Splash buy these post-industrial buildings, and then what they do is they sit on them for 5 years and give them cheap rent to artists, and then artists occupy them for 5 years or something, and then it changes the neighborhood in which this building sat, because young people get used to hanging out there, and there's cafes open because all these artists are there, and then they develop the building and they move the artists on, and so they've used artists to rebrand space in a really effective way. And you could imagine that in Belfast. I think Belfast is in an amazing position, because when you look at the cost of real estate in Dublin, artists just can't practice in Dublin. It's almost impossible. whereas Belfast still has a price. It's still a global city, and it has a real estate price that's affordable. I think it should really put a lot of effort into creating those sorts of spaces, because I think it could be a fantastic niche for Belfast to become the art city of the island. I really think so.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I know even because I always think that's a good option for Derry, because people always say Derry should be like the Galway of the north. It's kind of it's a small city, could be arty, could have a nice kind of vibe to it, and there's a sense to it, because I know I read this. I don't know if you read this book. Rory Sutherland. He's an advertising guy called the Alchemy, but part of his thesis is that all organizations and councils, they're just full of solicitors and accountants and bean counters, and there's very little diversity. Yeah. So everything's about pounds, shillings, and pence, and about everyone wants to attract in multinational companies to fill grade A office space and buy Costa coffee 5 times a day, and this. So no one is kind of thinking, it's kind of arts or culture or, these kind of soft things that we kind of need to make life worth living.
I really agree on that, because we in Manchester, we've had a lot of debates about that, because there's been no funding for any arts hardly in Manchester. Yet Manchester is famous for music, football. It's not famous for grade 1 office space. You know what I mean. Yeah. And so actually, how you brand a city, I think you're really right that actually, why do people want to go to Manchester? It's because of Oasis. It's because of the Stone Roses. It's because of those sorts of things. It's not because it's Britain's second city or something. And I think that's certainly true. And I think you're right and also I think the culture in these organisations, such as city councils, is all about preventing failure. Rather than making success happen. And that's a different thing to measure. The council are very, very frightened of failure. I know that from working for them. An embarrassment. Because I think you could also say that a lot of the local newspapers spend their time trawling council failure, rather than celebrating council success. So they're a product of another environment, which is a really sort of hostile press.
Yeah, I also think that part of the issue was people and the middle class have kind of excused themselves from like civic life and politics. And I mean, for Northern Ireland, you can understand that obviously because it's been such a head wreck in the past. But it's this kind of attitude of not getting involved in civic life or politics. So then it means that the people actually do. I mean, it's not a criticism of them because they're brave to do it, but it just kind of means you have this very narrow viewpoint of people who are actually engaged in civic life.
Yeah.
And that is a problem. I mean, really, because we need more diversity in politics and in civic life across the whole spectrum, other than these kind of career politicians who have just risen up the ranks.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think our islands took on a sort of an American dream of the nuclear family and things, that has made an unfriendly society, whereas in America, people are still incredibly friendly. When I moved onto the street here in Cornell, everyone came round with gifts, to welcome me and into the street, and I'll tell you what, you don't. I think that's disappeared out of our islands somewhat. I think we're getting more fearful of people, and I think you're right. The middle class people in particular have disappeared out of civic life in cities. Particularly you see that a lot in Northern Ireland, because obviously there was a flight to the burbs, during the Troubles, and it's meant that it's only recently really that middle class people have occupied the Ormore Road or the Malone Road, and there's more and more younger people occupying those spaces who are likely to be the next middle class. So that may change, but I think we need to start trusting people more, Brian.
Well, we were actually discussing this on one of our WhatsApp group earlier on. This because Norina Hertz, The Lonely Century is a book that's been out the past few months, and I was reading it the other week, and one of her pieces in the book is as people get more lonely, they get more fearful and suspicious, and she thinks this is kind of the reason why the rise of the far right and conspiracy theories and these kind of doing this incel movement you probably heard about, you know. And it's just kind of born out of loneliness, you know, it's kind of people get kind of angry and isolated. And I think a lot of that is in action here with the pandemic. I mean, people are obviously very scared because this is a horrible time, and it is quite easy just to sit in the house and watch Netflix and don't do anything, isn't it?
And most Netflix is about murder and death, isn't it? I try not to watch things that involve killing people, and actually you're very limited on Netflix about what you can watch that doesn't involve someone getting killed. So you can see how it comes about. But I think you're right, though. You see, when I was a kid, the whole neighborhood was built around the youth club attached to the church, and all those things, and I met a vast number of people, through community institutions, which hardly exist now. When my son was 14, there was nowhere for him to go. We were going to a youth club disco every Friday at 14, and he had nowhere to go. All those sort of community systems have disappeared, and I think that makes people, like you say, lonely and fearful, because we are a communal sort of creature, aren't we? We live in small community groups, extended family groups, and they've sort of disappeared,
It is, because there was a thing in the paper last week that said in research in Scotland was that the average Scottish teenage boy was it 7 hours or 9 hours a day on screens. I think it must be 9 hours. And it was just saying that the amount all their socializing now is within games. I know you can argue that they kind of wear these headsets and they're all talking to their mates and all that there, but just the sheer inactivity of young people now, not leaving the house. And I know you sound like some kind of old sod complaining about young people, but I think I blame the parents because we've entered this Faustian bargain of you're too scared to let your kids go out and play in the street because of cars or pedophiles or kidnapping and all that. And you think because they're sitting in their bedroom playing the Xbox, they're safe. But we're just kind of creating this generation who can't, those social skills are fearful. And from your students, they're all anxiety and depression and have all these social problems.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing that I know with my son, I was having a chat with him. He's 20 now, and I was having a chat with him in the pub. I said, give me 10 reasons why you hate me, as a joke, and he said, number 1, you never bought me a Nintendo DS. Because I was the bad parent that never let him go on the computer, and had to play out all the time, and he now holds that against me forever, but I felt the same thing that actually, the sort of the ability to read body language, the ability to negotiate, with people you don't know, gets lost if you don't go out. They're things that you learn from being out.
Did he turn out okay?
No, he's studying architecture at Glasgow School of Art at the moment. So he'll make me he'll ruin my reputation, I'm sure.
Is that the Macintosh building?
Yeah.
That burned down or something, or they had to rebuild it?
Yeah, they're on the second rebuild now. So it was nearly finished and it burned down again.
Okay. And where did he grow up, in Belfast or in Manchester?
He grew up in Manchester. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was always fascinated. Like the first time I went to Glasgow, I was like, my God, this place is just like Belfast. I mean, it's incredible, the similarities and these kind of post-industrial working class cities. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot kind of to it.
It's halfway between Belfast and Manchester, isn't it? I think it's sort of got. It's got the politics of Belfast with the sort of grandness of Manchester,
Yeah, Because that bit about you were saying when you were growing up about all the different groups, because I know I was listening to a podcast the other day about that. They were saying, in the 60s and 70s, people, you would have like works outings, and you'd have like work chess clubs and work tennis clubs and the social stuff, and all that's kind of been lost, as you say, in society. And I think we've thrown the kind of, we're richer now, but we're more alone.
Yeah. And we're working
and we're
harder.
more depressed. And,
we're working harder than we've ever worked, longer hours, particularly these two islands have the longest working hours in Europe, don't they? And which is really interesting, so actually there's less time to volunteer for things, to be part of things, I think you're right though about the sort of lack of trust that comes from that, and it creates it as well. You see, it's self-fulfilling, isn't it? When you start to not trust society, you start to withdraw from it. So there's less things, less volunteers, less people doing things, and I think it's a really interesting problem for cities, because cities are about people getting together. Neighborhoods were built around community intervention in places, whereas now neighborhoods are just an address,
Yeah. Yeah, you don't even know your neighbour half the time.
No.
Or more of a problem. Maybe you don't want to know your neighbour. That's even more of an issue, because that is a problem. Because I know I hear that a lot from people telling me, or you see it on kind of, I'm on that Reddit, and every week on the Northern Ireland subreddit, there's somebody saying how lonely they are and they've no friends, and other people are chiming in saying they're kind of bored and nothing to do and no hobbies. It's kind of a weird thing, because we have this problem where people work a lot, right? But they actually say that we've never had as much leisure time. Yeah. But we just kind of spend it staring at our phones and screens. Yeah. We don't really kind of do any hobbies anymore. It's hard, to get off your phone and actually do something else.
Yeah, well, it's amazing, isn't it? Because I was thinking that last year, where I used to play football, soccer for a team, and every pitch would be black because there'd be 20 games every Saturday on it and every Sunday. And now you go to the pitches and they're all green. There's far less football going on than there was. You go to any stretch of water and there's no one fishing. When I was a kid, there were people around every dirty puddle, there were people fishing, and now there's nobody fishing. Basically, I think we've gone from an active sort of pastime to like a passive one, watching Netflix, surfing on our phone, and these again are isolating things, that they but and I think they make quite interesting problems for how because the other thing about the social media is you only meet people like yourself. It's the great thing about cities is diversity, isn't it? That so many different sorts of people, and then suddenly you're on Facebook and everyone agrees with you about everything.
Yeah,
it's and that creates intolerance and difficulty in dealing with difference. Which could be negotiated perhaps previously.
Because the diversity thing, because people are saying that the pandemic was like a lot of middle class people sitting at home in their nice houses just ordering things online to be brought to them by working class people. and it is very, in the States, it's incredibly easy to kind of live in these kind of gated communities and just live in your own little bubble of privilege and screw everybody else,
Yeah, I can really see that. Well, especially, and the car's part of that, of course. Because you don't even set foot on the pavement. You get in the car and you drive, and you drive to a car park at work, and you never actually meet anybody who isn't in either your home bubble or your work bubble. And it's a real challenge for cities, I think, about what they're going to be like. I think the advantage is that people don't live forever. Different generations come along and it's all new to them, and they get into the things we got into, going out, partying, going to see bands, shooting the crap at various events. That's what we did as 20-somethings, and I presume that 20-somethings will always do stuff like that.
Well, I think we should also. Older people should be doing that as well, because that's what life's about, isn't it? Really getting out there and doing stuff.
Yeah, and actually, Well, actually, one thing you find if you I only go to certain gigs these days, but when I go there, the age of the people at them is so old now. It's like terrifying. I saw a certain ratio just before lockdown who are Manchester factory band, and the average age must have been 60 in the audience. It's like terrifying. It's like
Well, at least they're still going strong. I seen the God, what do you call them? The Irish rock band,
Ash or something like that, or U2.
No, the old ones from the 1970s, Dark Doom and. Horse Lips. They're a very famous Irish rock band. Right. And geez, the average age of our audience was in the 70s. But my God, it was a fantastic gig. They can still rock it. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said for keeping going.
Yeah, I just before my dad died, I took my dad to see the Dubliners in Manchester, and he was in tears at the end of the concert about how old everyone, he'd wasted life. It was quite sweet, really.
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm gonna have to stop it there because I have to pick up Junior from school. Greg, as always, I mean, the time's flown there. It was a great chat, wasn't it?
Yeah, great.
And I think from that, I mean, what you say is right. In communities, and if I was in government or council, that's the one thing I would be thinking of is how you can encourage people to kind of do community stuff and get together and. That is just such a no-brainer, isn't it? Arts and cultures and all this kind of stuff.
It really is, and getting people to take part in their shaping their place. Yeah, I really think so.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to cost much either. I mean, people think these things are, and I think you could almost have we need more, in Europe or South America, more of these fiestas and events, and just get people out and about, and for it. Right, excellent. Well, I'll say Professor Greg Keeffe is Professor of School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's. And when are you back at Queen's, Greg?
I'm back at Christmas, but I am going to come back here next semester as well because I've got some research to do. So I'm having a nice time.
What has been a critic do? Just kind of walk around the place criticising their architecture? Or just
I'm running a studio with some master's students about climate change, and I'm generally reviewing work around the school. Yeah, great.
Okay. Well, hopefully we might see you at some stage for a live event when civilization returns.
Yeah, hopefully.
All right, perfect. Right, thanks, Greg.
Okay, see you later.